Hi, welcome back to On the Level Leadership, and this week I want to discuss the issue of narcissistic personalities in our office and how to deal with them. So, how do you know you're dealing with a narcissist in the office or as a boss? This is a really difficult situation to deal with, and I would say that every single one of us, at some point or other in our careers, either as a manager or as or a leader or as an employee, is going to either have to deal with a colleague or perhaps even a boss that has some narcissistic personality traits. Okay, so the narcissistic personality disorder is a formal diagnosis. It's a psychiatric disorder, a mental health disorder, and it is something that I would suggest you not go around diagnosing if you're not a mental health practitioner. But for your own information, the Mayo Clinic describes a narcissistic personality disorder as being one of several personality disorders where the person has an inflated sense of their self-importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, a lack of empathy for others. So how do you know if this is the kind of person you're working with? Well, there are a few key signs that you're working with a narcissist or someone who has narcissistic personality traits. They might not necessarily have the full diagnosis, but they're certainly showing evidence of certain traits of narcissism. And this can be a super toxic person to have in the office. They can really disrupt the whole culture and the dynamics in the office. One of them is if the person is a conversation hoarder. So you're at meetings and all they want to do is talk about them, talk about what they've been doing, talk about what their team is doing, talk about their own opinions, their own endeavors. They really want to give their opinions and they're super long-winded in what they have to say. Another trait of a narcissist is one who name drops. They'll talk about a VIP that they mingle with, or that they golfed with the vice president of the office, or something, because they want to make themselves feel and look more important because they are hanging out with more important people. They tend to be a spotlight hogger, so they're the ones at meetings that are always the center of attention. They're the first to speak. They are, again, the longest-winded. They have the most opinion. They are quick to express their accomplishments and what they're doing and how successful they are. They can be super powerful and influential because they're get-it-done type people, and they actually can be very, very productive individuals. They can sometimes take disproportionate credit for things where their team will lead a huge initiative, but then they take responsibility or accountability for the entire initiative, where they'll say, I did something rather than we as a team did something. Narcissists can be super charming and super persuasive, but they make big promises but don't always follow through on those promises. They often try to break the rules and social norms. They push the boundaries. They're constantly pushing social boundaries and will try to take shortcuts where they can. So in the situation where I was working at one time, was working with an individual who was maybe cutting some corners that was pushing the limits and boundaries around what was allowed under our Financial Administrations Act, for example. So there's always sort of this need to kind of push the boundaries to get what they want to get done as quickly as they can. And they don't really almost care, right, what rules they break along the way. Narcissists can also be super sensitive to criticism. They do not like to be criticized. In fact, they get very defensive and they will deflect. You'll find that they'll be the ones that will blame others for their failings. It's always somebody else's fault for them not being able to do something. They can never take accountability for their own actions. This is classic. I was raised by a narcissist, and it was something my father was really good at doing, which was not taking responsibility for his actions. It was always somebody else's fault that he didn't do something in a way that should have been done. There also can be very passive aggressive. The use of things like stonewalling and gaslighting, those are kinds of things. Victimhood, like playing the victim, and everybody's always out to get me, and I'm always being attacked, and they tend to put other people down. Everybody's always the loser. And so those passive aggressive tendencies where you'll have this sort of hostile joking that will take place, or they'll try to do things like socially exclude you by not inviting you to a staff meeting, or maybe they're, being deliberately weak and trying to elicit sympathy and favor from people. They kind of like play these kind of games with people in the office. Narcissists have a superior and inferior orientation. People, if they look at you as their superior, they may defer to you almost from a position of weakness. And if they see themselves as superior to you, or see you as their inferior, they will treat you accordingly. The other last piece is that they tend to be really negative and can really express very toxic emotions. So again, it's all about being powerful. It's all about gaining attention, making sure that you stay insecure in your position so that they can feel empowered. And they're often very quick to judge and criticize other people. So first of all, we just have to remember that narcissists are made. They're not born. They come usually from a history of trauma, some kind of abusive background. There's a history there. And people who have these kinds of tendencies tend to come from backgrounds that maybe aren't as healthy, because narcissists are not people who have healthy egos. If they had a healthy ego, they wouldn't feel the need to continually demean and take advantage of others for their own gain. What do you do if you're working with somebody who's like this? Well, I can speak from personal experience. It is extremely difficult to work with a narcissist. Because I was raised by a narcissist, my father was a malignant narcissist. He was not diagnosed as such, but I can tell you that he was a malignant narcissist, and he was pathological with him. And one of the things that was really difficult growing up in that environment was that I found myself really angry and resentful of having to deal with this person who continually gaslit us and always tried to make it look like we were the crazy ones. We were the ones that were nut bars, and that he was making sense and we weren't. And so I think dealing with the controlling nature of the narcissist, the need to be in control, really, as I grew up, made me a very defensive leader. And it was really actually not a very healthy way to be. To this day, when I work with a narcissist, in fact, recently I've had this experience in a work environment situation, I find it really hard not to react, not to just knee-jerk respond with my own ego. It is probably the hardest thing to do, is to not let them get to you. And unfortunately, what you have to do, and it takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of strength on your part, is to recognize that they are never going to change. They are never going to change their ways of life and behaviors unless they so choose to. You are not going to change a narcissist's perspective. Sharing what you feel with them might actually be a fuel for them to use against you. So one of the things I have found is that the number one thing you cannot do with a narcissist is engage. You cannot engage because they're looking for you to engage. Because a narcissist wins when you engage and you give them the fuel they need to try to continue to make you look like the crazy one, right? So how do you then deal with this in a productive manner? And I think there's quite a few articles. If you go to Forbes or Inc.com or the Harvard Business Review, you will find a number of articles out there that will help you protect yourself against certain narcissistic traits or personalities that you may find in the office. I'm going to share a few of these that I have from a few articles. This one in particular is from Forbes.com, and I will link the article to that kind of talks about how to protect yourself in the work environment. The first thing is to establish boundaries. This is super important. You need to establish boundaries for yourself, because just agreeing to do something for anyone is, we may be thinking we're doing the right thing by doing something, but with a narcissist, you have to be really careful that they're not going to respect your boundaries. So you're going to set a boundary and you're going to say you're going to do a thing a certain way, and then they're going to continue to push your boundaries further and further and further. So it's really important that you establish your boundaries, and that if they try to push your boundaries and you push back on that, they will likely get upset with you. So, but be really clear with a narcissist. You have to be super clear on maintaining those boundaries. As I said before, the thing that's super important is to not let your ego get engaged, because you're not going to win. You're just not going to win that battle. You cannot just give them a piece of your mind, right? That's not recommended. It's not recommended by therapists. It's not recommended by any of the business coaches out there. You really just can't go and tell a narcissist what is on the top of your mind. You need to recognize the narcissistic behavior for what it is. Then you need to learn to control your own ego, because you need to win, and you will not win if you lose control of your ego. the narcissist wins if you lose control of your ego. In other words, if you get really pissed off and you start losing your cool with somebody in the office because they played some narcissistic manipulation game with you, you're the one who's actually going to end up being pulled to HR with a complaint against you rather than the opposite direction. So you have to be really careful to make sure that you don't lose control of your frustration, your anger, and your own ego. So you need to use these moments to really grow, right? Rather than trying to prove a point or to try to be right with this individual, you just need to make sure that you, again, reassert your boundaries, whatever those are, and be very clear about what you're willing to accept or not accept. In my case, I'm very clear with saying things like with my father, for example, I would give him boundaries where I would say, do not yell at me like this again, or else this will happen. I will not tolerate this any longer, and be very clear about it. In the office, it might be, sorry, I'm working from 8 to 4. I will not be doing your bidding after 4 o'clock because I was hired to work these hours. Or maybe your boundaries is after 7 o'clock at night when I'm taking care of my children, this is a boundary that I'm putting on myself, and the narcissist may want to try to play that off. It's really hard to not lose your cool with the narcissist, but it's super important that you be the solid one in the equation. Don't use the word narcissist. Number one, because you're not a therapist likely. And even if you are a therapist, you haven't probably done the full assessment on this person that you're working with. But even if you think they are a narcissist, do not use the word narcissist, because that's just only going to throw them off. And when they're being accused of being narcissistic, it's only going to enrage them and make your life at work even harder. If they're your boss, they're going to look for a reason to fire you or to make your life miserable. If they're your employee, if they're your colleague, they're going to do everything to make your life miserable and to try to, find a way to ruin your reputation. And if they're your employee, they're going to make life even harder for you as a boss. The other thing too is just remember that wherever you are, if a line has been crossed that is abusive, or they're now bad-mouthing you, or there's defamation of character at play here, these are the kinds of things that, you want to make sure you nip in the bud as soon as possible. So if a narcissist tries to attack you in some way or somehow demean you or, disorient you in your career somehow, it's really important where possible to go to the HR department and formally complain against this individual if need be. So the other piece to it is letting them believe what they want. Let them think that they're holier than thou if that's what they think. Let them think that they're better than everybody else. Who cares? At the end of the day, you need to protect your own self and your own personal ego and your own career. So, if they want to think they're higher than everybody else, and let them be. Who cares? I mean, you can look at this from a compassionate perspective that they're clearly broken, because if they had a healthy ego, they wouldn't need to do this. And the only thing is that sometimes these narcissists are put in leadership positions, and that can be a super toxic environment for that organization, because when narcissists become leaders, and they often do because they're usually very productive and they will get stuff done no matter the cost, and that's often valued, unfortunately, in corporate situations. The problem is that once they're in leadership positions, they tend to push the boundaries even further. They can become a root in the toxicity of the organization over time, which, but it happens a lot. It happens a lot, unfortunately, to this day. The other thing, too, is you need to detach yourself in whatever way necessary. So, again, I had a circumstance where I was essentially being attacked by a narcissist with long-winded emails, and everybody CC'd on it to try to make me look bad. And at the end of the day, I have to detach from that. And as hard as that was, it was necessary that I let go of those, of the deflections, that I let go of the attack, and that I let go of the person's perspective of me. At the end of the day, it didn't really matter, because they feed off of that energy, and I didn't want to give that person any more of my energy. If they think that they can exploit you in some way, they will. When they realize they can't exploit you, they get frustrated by it, and they may try to find other ways to go around you to try to, ruin your career, try to ruin your reputation. They'll want to try to win. Sometimes they'll try to win you back. Sometimes you'll push back on them and you'll deflect or not really show that you don't have a need for them. And all of a sudden they realize, well, they have a need to be needed. They need to be liked and wanted. And so they may try to win you back by promising you things or bringing you into the fold or inviting you to special parties or that kind of thing. But just make sure that if they pull at your heartstrings, that you don't get sucked into it. Because again, with narcissists, we're dealing with people who don't have healthy egos, and will try to pull you in so that they can just continue to feed their own ego and their own needs rather than yours. A narcissistic type person often gets things done because they want to look good. And so they can be really productive, and having a narcissist employee might not always be a bad thing from a management perspective, because they will do whatever it takes to get things done. But that said, though, just make sure that if you're an employee asking for something of a boss who's a narcissist and they said yes verbally, get it in writing, right? If you ask a favor of them and they said yes, make sure you get it in writing. Get everything in writing with a narcissist, good or bad, because that way you can defend yourself if you need to, but you can also use that information if required. Tip and advice there, just make sure you get everything in writing. The other thing I read recently about narcissists, in particular if you work for a narcissistic boss, is there was actually an article that was written. I cannot remember the name of the author right now, but he basically said that he's a coach, an executive coach. And one of the things he said was, if you're working for a narcissistic boss, your choices are leave voluntarily, get yourself fired, or stay and become very unwell in yourself. Because his opinion was, if you work for a narcissistic boss, there really is no win for you as an employee. So something to think about when you're in your work environment is, if you're working alongside a colleague, if you have a choice to change teams, or you have the opportunity to do something else somewhere else where you're not in direct contact with that person anymore, it may be worthwhile for you to get some distance between you and this individual. For an employee, it might be a little harder because they're hired into your team. You could have a say in their performance agreements. You could have a say whether they get fired or not, or whether they're let go. It's hard though, because often narcissists are super productive and they actually don't have performance issues per se. It's the personality that gets in the way. So it depends. I mean, you may have some control as an employer or as a boss yourself, but if they're your colleague or your boss and you find yourself having to work with them on a regular basis, it can be really exhausting for you as an individual. So I would suggest that you take some serious considerations around how you're going to protect yourself over the long term. If you're working for a company where you have a very narcissistic boss, it may be worthwhile for you to think about looking elsewhere for an opportunity so you're not having to deal with that particular person anymore. Not to say that you're not going to have another issue like that in another organization. Likelihood is you're going to find someone else somewhere else that has these personality traits. So it's really important to find ways to cope with it. But at the end of the day, if your life is really miserable in the workplace because you're having to deal with this individual on a regular basis, it may be worthwhile thinking about, how do I distance myself from this person? Maybe it's a request for a transfer. Maybe you want to work for the same company, but in a different area. So you're not having to deal with that person every day. Maybe, you do look for opportunities at different companies. So again, you don't have to deal with that person every day. I wouldn't suggest getting your butt fired, because that makes it a lot harder to get a job if you're fired. But definitely, I think if you can leverage an opportunity elsewhere. And then the opt to stay is always there. But if you stay, you have to find ways to protect yourself so that you're not exhausting yourself emotionally and psychologically and taking a hit every 5 minutes from this individual. If the abuse or the passive aggressive behaviors are non-ending and a consistent and persistent thing in your day-to-day work, it can be super exhausting and really hard on our own mental health. So I would encourage you, if you're working with somebody on a regular basis who's narcissistic in nature, that you may want to think about leaving. And really, at the end of the day, if you may find that you go to a different opportunity elsewhere and it's fantastic, and you'll say thank you to the narcissist, because if it wasn't for them, you wouldn't have pushed yourself to grow, you wouldn't have pushed yourself to do something different, and maybe you wouldn't have actually risen to the occasion if you didn't have that person there. And also, you can thank a narcissist because they can really help you develop those resiliency skills that you otherwise might not have had if you didn't have that person in your life. I know that my father, as difficult as he was, he taught me some good things. He taught me how to work hard. He had a really strong work ethic. He was not detail oriented, but he was a get stuff done kind of person. He was pretty loyal and, a man of his word. When he said he would do things, he usually got it done. But he was very controlling, and he also had very narcissistic, it's all about him type personality traits. So I think there were take the good where you can, learn the good things from the boss that you're working with, because maybe your boss is, super astute at negotiating contracts. Learn what you can from that person. And then if the narcissism is too much, then look to leave. So that's what I wanted to cover this week. Dealing with narcissists in the office is about the hardest thing you could ever do, but I wish you well in that. I hope that the tidbits helped you in understanding and recognizing what a narcissist is, and maybe in giving you some tips on how to deal with them. Thanks again for watching On the Level Leadership. I really do appreciate you being here, and if you got anything out of this video, give it a big thumbs up. If you want to get more content like this on a weekly basis, make sure to subscribe, because I'm here every week.